Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited for today's conversation. We have with us today Marieke Flament, who's the CEO at the Foundation and also a fantastic fintech entrepreneur and operator. So we're going to learn a ton about all sorts of business structure, fintech strategy, and of course, Web3 protocol strategy. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. Marieke, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Lex. Thank you so much for having me here. Looking forward to the conversation.
You've done so many exciting and high-profile things, but I want to get us kind of acquainted a little bit with your values and what drove you to make some of the choices that led you to the decisions around, joining Circle, joining Mettle, joining Near. And that often comes through in people's kind of DNA in their early career. Can you talk a little bit about how you started out, what it is that you were focused on, and what were the types of things that really motivated you early on in your journey?
I mean, if we start from the beginning, actually, I spent a lot of time in my childhood moving around and living in different countries. So one of the fundamental value that has been and a driving force throughout my career is actually this idea that if you live in different countries or if you see different things, culture and languages and the way people see the world is different everywhere. So that's one fundamental piece. Then as a student, I'm a computer science engineer. So I studied engineering at Télécom Paris in France. And then very early on, actually realized that while it's an engineering school and we were learning about coding and developing, I realized that I loved the tech, but I was never going to be a very strong or very good developer. Sometimes you can see that you're more attracted to other pieces of the puzzle. And for example, for me, it was more this idea of what's business? How do you drive actually adoption of technology? And so early on, I had an opportunity to actually go and finish my studies in China, in Shanghai. That was 2004. It was still early, when I look at it now, I think it was a bit crazy because at the time, communication lines between, leaving France and going to China were not necessarily the same. A lot of the platforms we know today didn't exist. But nevertheless, so I did that. I went to China. I learned Mandarin. I finished my computer science degree in information security in Shanghai. And then I was on the hunt for a job. I wanted to stay in China because I loved the culture, the vibe, this constant thinking of everything is possible. That's one of the value that I learned in China, this relentlessness of finding solutions and having a sense that problems have solutions and you can find a way through them. I found a job, I would say more by luck, but extremely lucky. Actually, I worked for LVMH, the luxury giant conglomerate, in their IT department to start with. And so I was very early on exposed to the power of storytelling and the power of actually brands, but also the power of small, nimble teams, right? Because one of the core fundamental value of the LVMH group is actually having a lot of very independent brands that are remotely operated by very strong local leaders. So that was quite formative. And then I actually had an opportunity to work for a fantastic mentor who was based in Hong Kong, who was leading the financial department for LVMH. And so I did that and I retrained myself completely, right? Because I went from being a, IT project manager to basically becoming a financial analyst and not, having to learn what is a P&L, what's a balance sheet on the ground. So I would say, do things, this idea of like culture, retrain, what is technology, how can small, nimble teams work together, that started to make a narrative and a sense. But one thing I also realized quite early on in my career was that I didn't understand business, actually. When you're trained as an engineer, you see the world of like problem solving, but you don't necessarily understand more fundamental pieces of how to run a business. What are economics, what's finance, what's a business plan, what's a strategy, and so on and so forth.
I'm going to give you a frustrating question. What is business? When you say to know business, what is that?
A business is a composition of different angles and different aspects, right? So a business, it's who are your customers? What's the problem that you're solving? How are you actually making revenues? How are you getting your customers? What's the composition of the team that you need to actually make that successful? So it's all those pieces and elements for me that I would say like that's business. I learned also more elements of like business back in business school. Getting out of business school, I did something that I think most students in business school do. I went into strategy consulting. Again, learned a ton around like, strategy. What is it? How do you actually advise companies and how you think about putting in place strategic plans? I did that in Paris, although I was traveling again a lot, like covering a lot of ground and different international companies. And then I worked for Expedia. So travel industry, which matches a lot of my passion. I was exposed to phenomenal leadership, but also the power of technology and how to think go-to-market and how to think marketing with different channels and how to think very data-driven with a very data-driven approach on all of that. So that was super interesting. And I was headhunted in 2015 for Circle, which, at the time I didn't know anything about Bitcoin. I didn't know anything about blockchain. And I remember perfectly when the headhunter called me and they said, hey, there's a startup in Bitcoin. They're looking for someone. And my first reaction was like, well, hell no. The Bitcoin price was so bad that my immediate reaction was like, this is for drug dealers. So I'm not doing that. And I'm lucky because the headhunter insisted and he said, please read the brief. And then I read the brief and I understood that actually, there were blockchain, there was cryptography, there was like so many things that this could unveil. And so I worked for Circle. I worked for Jeremy Allaire for over 3 years, which was a phenomenal learning experience.
What does Circle look like in 2015, 2016? Because, there's no USDC, there are no stable coins. It's a very different moment. There's no Ethereum yet, really. There's no Web3. It's just like, how many Litecoin clones can people launch and so on. So can you describe what you stepped into and what were the operating components of that business?
Yeah, so what I stepped into was Circle at the time had a product called Circle Pay, which was peer-to-peer sending and receiving money, not only fiat, but also to start with only Bitcoin. And that product was actually, if you think of it, it was like Venmo, but on steroids, right? Completely global Venmo. And the beauty of that app was that just knowing someone's email address or phone number, you could actually send them money. So the first vision was, and I think that's one of the things that's actually extremely powerful, is the vision has stayed the same, which is like, with crypto and tokenization, we can basically rethink how money moves around. But the different products that have been, led to the path where Circle is at today were a bit different. So so the first app that what I stepped into was, I think, a team of like something like maybe 50, 60 people. 95% of those were in the US. Very few people in Europe. I think maybe a handful of folks that were in Dublin because we had a small operation there. And then a product, which was Circle Pay, which was looking at how can we do things that are peer-to-peer. That was the first iteration. And then from there, we actually grew Circle Pay a lot and significantly. We iterated the product itself also because, so back then, I remember, when we were pitching the product and it had Bitcoin in it, people just didn't understand. And the press around Bitcoin was so negative that it was actually almost like why would you have that in the app? And I remember, especially having debates with, friends, but also like, for example, on the UK market where we were trying to drive adoption. And ultimately it was not seeing Bitcoin that made people feel comfortable with engaging with the app, right? It was completely different world. So if you imagine that today, it would be quite different. And I think people would probably be more attracted to the fact that there's Bitcoin. But anyway, so that was, those were the operations back then.
There was also, I remember, like a brokerage arm, right? Like there was a trading app functionality. There was quite a couple of different concerns that Circle was trying to stand up.
So that came after, right? So then we went into different other products, right? So we made an acqui-hire of a team and had a product which was called Circle Invest, which I think things has been sold. There was the acquisition of one of the first exchange, Poloniex. We had also a OTC trading desk, because when you start actually managing so many flows of cryptocurrency, then that business also made sense. And as you said, right, back then, like early days, Ethereum was not even there, which I remember actually the birth of that, and the conversations that we were having in the company and thinking through how is that going to change everything, and how then we started thinking through tokenization of everything, and what does it mean for other industries, and so on and so forth. But it was basically a suite of different products, which then also led to actually the creation of USDC, because the realization through that of Sean and Jeremy, which I think is phenomenal. When I look back, I also remember reactions of like thinking through a stable coin, why would we do that? And actually today in hindsight, it looks like it's genius. But again, when you sat there, it was not that obvious, right? That was where like the big bets that would basically drive the entire company, but also the entire industry moving forward.
It's fascinating stuff. Were you there through the sort of simplification and then consolidation of the business?
Yes. Yeah. So I stayed until early 2019. And so a couple of things were happening back then, right? One was actually the crypto market was, had a first
it was
drop.
Not good.
It was not good. That's also one thing that's been very formative, right? It's learning through how fast things can go really bad, and having this sense of like, okay, you need to adapt, and therefore what do you keep, what do you actually what do you kill in terms of product. And as a company also, we refocused more from B2C to much more B2B in terms of lines of products and so on and so forth. So that's the consolidation that happened, actually, like going to what that we should focus on, and basically where is also the line of revenue, right? Where are the revenue coming from, which geographies should we focus on, and so forth.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was, I think, a moment of sharpening the diamonds in a lot of different places. Where did your career take you after Circle, and how are you looking around? What decisions were you making then?
Yeah, so after Circle, basically I was looking for, what do I do that, is different, or how to basically find a new path forward. And actually I was, again, headhunted for, this time for NatWest. So very different, like working within a very large bank. And it's not creating because the project was already kickstarted, but it was basically making a neobank within a large bank. And I have huge admiration and respect actually for a leader like Alison Rose, who is one of the few women, leading a very large bank. And when I was working with her and thinking through strategy and the vision that she had for trying to create within a large bank a neobank, I thought, well, that could be also very interesting. Full disclosure, also, I was a new mom, so I thought, okay, traveling so much when kids are tiny, maybe not necessarily a good idea. And so NatWest is also something that's very UK focused, and so something that felt I could lead and take on. And so I joined Mettle, and there is a thread here, which I joined Mettle similar size as when I joined Circle. It was a team of roughly 50 people, but a team mostly of actually contractors. And so I had to basically professionalize that, right? And say, how does this become really properly a company? How do we build the team and the structure? How do we scale from this? How do we actually interact with the bank, and what does it mean to innovate within a large corporation? The focus of Mettle is actually freelancers, sole traders. So a theme around working 9 to 5 and the way we work, and that's changing, right? So therefore, for that, you need to have a different bank, and something that's much more attuned to people's ways of working of today.
Let me double click on this idea, right? Because I think there's some interesting and difficult fintech insights here, which is that, okay, so you take NatWest, or, we can take JP Morgan, or we can take Goldman Sachs, right? So each one of these has launched. Goldman's got Marcus, JPM had a couple of neobanks now, open, shut. There's a question of, well, why? Especially, I had a seat for a while that was analyzing these public companies and putting a fintech innovation lens on top and trying to rank them and understand their performance on being able to do that innovation. And so the question is, and a lot of banks say this defensively, mostly to people that own their shares, they say that, we already have this massive distribution. We already have the scale and the products. And so why do these companies need these new faces? Why do they need neobanks? What does it even mean to have a neobank for a very large retail bank?
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic question. So yes, banks say we have, very large distribution, and we have millions of customers, and the way bank operate is very often thinking through a product, right? So it's almost like this it's a given that I have an audience, and therefore which products can I basically push to my audience, right? And so it's like a very, well, surely people are going to need a lending product and a credit product, and therefore it's like a very product minded, but without thinking about the customer. And where fintech are actually brilliant is flipping it, is saying, okay, who's the customer? What's the job to be done? What's the problem to solve? And therefore, around that, how do I bring and build a brilliant product? But it's flipping it, right? It's like you start from the customer. Who is it? What's the problem? And what do you need to do? And it sounds maybe like a, not that different way of operating, but it's fundamentally different. Because if you operate in a world where you say, I have a large user base, and therefore I'm going to push product on them, then the way you structure your organization is very different from if you say, well, who's my customer? What are the jobs to be done? And therefore, what's the product I need to build to serve the needs of my customer? And so innovation, and for example, Mettle, the way I built Mettle and the way it was built was basically to say, well, what are the jobs to be done? What are the functions that we need to do to focus on serving the needs of our customer? What's our tech stack, therefore? And how do we constantly stay nimble around our customers? And so ultimately, it means that your go-to-market is different. The way you structure your team is different. The tech stack that we have is completely different. And then the brand and how you interact with customers is going to be totally different. So, that's why very often you find large banks who continuously try to, innovate and shift and improve the tech stack and improve the ways of working and so on and so forth. But it's much, much, much harder to do that if you already have like a, legacy tech and legacy people structure, rather than actually saying, well, what if we start from scratch, right? What if we actually start on the side, leverage the best of what we have in a large bank, which is actually a lot of knowledge around FinCrime and anti-money laundering and KYC and KYB and all the stuff that is boring, or sound boring, but is extremely important. And if you can match that with actually innovation and different ways of doing things, then you can actually get somewhere.
Let's pick a different bank then, because I don't want to put you on the spot with Mettle, but let's say in the abstract, there's a retail bank, and in the abstract, they have a consumer-facing digital offering. Do you think it will work? Do you think it is sufficient defense against the Chimes and Revoluts and Cash Apps? Do you think it's sufficient defense to do, like digital transformation and corporate venture and setting up a new brand? It looks like it's sort of working for Goldman. And then if I think about asset management, like it's sort of working for Schwab, maybe. In general, what's your sense for how strong of a strategic response it is for the mega banks to create essentially these niche distribution solutions?
Well, so I think one thing that it actually does is that it can act as a catalyst within the larger organization, right? So, and that's often, it's less seen, right? But what happens and what you see in a lot of those large banks that actually have those smaller innovation play is that then a lot of the features of the smaller innovation play can be taken and done in the larger organization. So it's almost like a test bed. And then culturally, what starts happening is also it can help attract talent. So you can, with the innovation arm or like the smaller venture, attract a totally different type of talent, which then can actually by, trying to break boundaries or trying to do things differently, trying to think differently through cultures, through ways of working, it becomes, even if 10% of that only penetrates the larger organization, that can already be a win. Now, the bigger question for me is, you mentioned like Revolut and there is Tide and Starling and so on and so forth, but there is also a bigger movement that's happening, right? Which is where I'm actually, just questioning banks and roles of bank in the future. But when we think of crypto and when we think of actually the fundamental shift that we're seeing with Web3, the market is being redefined for what it means to actually interfere, interject, or basically have assets from a customer perspective. And sometimes some of the reaction that I see from large bank is just, well, we'll just shut down accounts of our customers if they actually start, interacting with crypto without necessarily trying to go deeper than that. Now, I think that's extremely risky because, and I'm sure we're going to come on to that, but crypto is not just like crypto trading and crypto assets. Crypto is redefining how we work, how we engage, how we actually define and make a living and make our career. So that like underlying movement. I'm more, if I was in the shoes of a bank today, or bank exec, I would be more trying to understand like what is that going to be. Because if you start shutting down people who are just interacting with crypto, it could be that very soon you're left with no customers, right? So the fintech revolution that we've seen with the Revolut and the Tide and starting and so on and so forth, that's fine. But I think that's V1, right? And I think the tsunami of transformation that are coming, that are touching not just the finance world and how we actually interact with our finances, I think that is actually much more an underlying force that is not to be underestimated.
Absolutely. Let's move from the fintech world back into the protocol Web3 world. Talk to us about your transition to Near, how that came about, and then maybe frame a little bit what Near is.
Sometimes signals come and you're like, oh, maybe the world is trying to tell me something. So I think it was towards last summer or end of summer, actually the board of NatWest and the team at NatWest were reached out also to say, hey, CBDC, stablecoin, we're trying to understand that and to rethink through that, because I had been in the space before. I helped and participated and basically replunged myself into the whole world of what was going on, in the hope to help actually educate, right? And to say like, this is how things work. And if you look at history from Bitcoin to Ethereum and so on and so forth, and it's just not just about cryptocurrencies, it's a larger, broader movement. So I was, in addition to leading Mettle and continuing to grow the bank, but I was basically helping also on that front. And at the same time, actually, the Near team reached out, and I hadn't heard of Near at the time. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like, how come I've never heard about them? Because if what they say is true with the tech, then this is extremely powerful. Because, when I was at Circle, we were talking already about tokenization of everything, but I think it's fair to say that it was probably too early, right? The concept was there, and Jeremy is a visionary, so he could see it, and he was like, well, this is going to play out like that. But the tech was just not ready. So no matter how much we were trying to find those use cases, they just didn't exist. And it was because the tech couldn't scale, and it was still too expensive to run and not doing what we wanted it to do. So when the team at Near reached out, I thought, oh, wow, if that tech is really there, which then in looking at it, I was like, wow, it is very easy to use. It is actually something that is seamless. It is really cheap to run on. And the consensus mechanism is different. So that's when I, started relooking back at that, and I've been super impressed with the team, with the people I met, whomever it is from the ecosystem, and the ambition level that there is, but also the long-term thinking. So if we take a step back, Near is a layer 1 protocol. So that's the family of things that play in and play with. And as a protocol, the focus is on, basically it's on 3 things. So one, it's simplicity. And simplicity is simplicity for end users, but also simplicity for developers. Simplicity for end users mean stuff that you can understand, right? So for example, you can have an address which is lex.near or marique.near, right? You can have an address that's recognizable. You can actually embed Near into Web2 apps in a way that is seamless. So for example, we are embedded with Sweatcoin. You don't see it, right? You don't see that it's actually powered by Near. So that's the user simplicity. Simplicity for developers mean that actually, as a developer, if you are not like Rust or Solidity ninja guru, then you can actually do JavaScript, right? Because there is, tens of millions of JavaScript developers. And so we believe that actually it's a must if you want adoption and mass adoption of tech, to have something that the majority of developers can participate on. So that's the big angle of simplicity. And then scalability and security comes through. So Near protocol is a proof of stake mechanism. It's not proof of work, which is what Bitcoin, for example, and Ethereum are. And so with proof of stake, you can basically engage in a different consensus mechanism that therefore triggers less energy consumption and is therefore more scalable because it's actually cheaper to run. And through sharding, which is basically splitting the network into different streamlines, if you wish, you can actually scale it infinitely. So the concept for a Near protocol, it's not to have actually miners, but it's to have validators, right? And so validators own a certain number of tokens, and therefore they can participate in the consensus mechanism. So that means that the network is cheaper to run, it's extremely secure, it's fast, and it's extremely fast to actually run applications on it. And ultimately, that gives us an opportunity to be sustainable, right? So sustainability and being carbon neutral is at the core of the entire ecosystem, but also, of course, the protocol. And so we work with South Pole, for example, as an organization to do that. So, that's the near protocol positioning, is that is simplicity, scalability, security, sustainability. And those are like the technical element of what it does. And the Near Foundation, which is the part I lead, is a pebble within a very large ecosystem. And I'm sure we can come back on that.
Thank you for that. It is true that Near is a pretty fantastic protocol, very performant, great architecture, great bridging to other parts of Web3. One of the things that I think the industry is chewing through now, and if you talk to venture investors and you talk to developers, one of these like recurring topics is just the multi-chain environment, like the connectivity through different bridges or atomic swaps or whatever it is. What's the answer? How do you think about, the internet of blockchains, the web of blockchains that right now is being built out? Because there are so many kind of fantastic solutions and scaling solutions and rollups and really kind of performant protocols that are coming online now after, years of very hard work. How do you see the ecosystem structure bringing this together, and sort of like what are the real vectors and forces that are gluing all of the different projects into a single whole?
The way we think about that is like multi-chain world with bridges and connections. And ultimately, if you fast forward, so, okay, who knows if it's going to be, is it going to be 5 major chains, 10, 20? Not sure, right? But this idea that actually chains are specific to, I think there's 2 elements that we're starting to see. One, there is a use case element of certain chains are actually better for running certain things. So for example, Near, because of the simplicity for users, actually, it's a perfect use case for B2C use cases and mass adoption, right? So that's one thing. Certain other chains might be actually, perfect for maybe extremely DeFi because, I don't know, speed of transaction is super, super important. Not that Near is slow, it's also really fast, but maybe some chains are going to focus purely on that. It might be more difficult to interact with, right? So this idea, like certain chains better for certain use cases. And then I think there's also another element, which is almost like geography, because chains are, and protocols, around protocols, you have communities. And communities, no matter, even if we're a very global world, communities tend to gather through actually cultural elements, right? So like actually languages and interests that are in common. And so we're also starting to see that a little bit emerge, which is like, what's the footprint of a certain protocol in a certain geography? I think overall, from a user perspective, we're really not there, right? I mean, on Near, Aurora, which is our EVM, is absolutely fantastic. It helps actually bridge Ethereum and other chains to the Near protocol. So that's great. But from a user perspective, it's still so confusing, right? You're like, okay, so this coin that I have, is it, can I make it on that chain? If I take it on another chain, does it still work? Oh no, because it's a translation of it. So it's not actually the real coin. So I think that is like all super confusing. Same if you go into, NFTs, and we're starting to see a lot of like platforms that are multi-chain, therefore help you bring together your, let's say, NFT collection, because otherwise you have, a collection here, a collection there, and it's not like one thing that brings it all together. So there is still a lot of work to be done to make this, like, again, seamless for end users. And I think that's the key, right? It's like when we get to a point where we don't have to talk about layer ones anymore, but we talk about the use cases. I think that's real adoption, right? Today we're still very focused on like the tech and the difference and what it can do, but not yet like on these end user cases which are seamless, and then end users don't need to know what's the underlying technology and how it works.
What are some of the coolest things that you were seeing being built on the protocol? Like if Near is an ecosystem and an economy, what are the things that to you are the most compelling? Or alternately, another way to ask this might be, what are the kinds of things that you'd like to see being built, in addition to some of the usual suspects?
In addition to usual suspect, I get always really excited when I see applications that are beautiful. And what I mean by beautiful is like it's the user experience is seamless and it looks actually close to what we know in Web 2. And so we do have projects around that are very focused on making seamless user experience. For example, flipping on its head what Instagram is. There's a project called UMinter, which looks absolutely stunning, and again, it's super easy to use. But it's the idea to say, well, if you're an influencer, you really own your picture and you really own your account, and so you change the paradigm of what you see in Instagram. I think that's super interesting. I'm really excited by DAOs. I think on Near you have AstroDAO, which is a platform which is so easy to use to actually start creating DAOs, for example, for a small group of people or a larger group of people who want to start making decisions together. And so that I think is extremely powerful. I think there's a lot of figuring out how a DAO best work, like governance and who votes on what, and how do you make sure you engage the member of the DAO and so on and so forth. It's complicated, but I think that's actually so interesting for rethinking how we work and how we engage with what we actually are passionate about. I really like that. We've been partnering with Orange DAO, which is a Y Combinator alumni DAO. And I think it's really super interesting to see people of common, let's say common background or common storytelling get together to make decisions together and to figure out, on what they want to either invest or build or things like that. So I think DAO overall, super excited about. And then the last thing that I've been recently extremely impressed by is gaming. So on Near, we have a guild called Human Guild who helps basically foster a lot of the new games that we see. And so full disclosure, I'm not a gamer myself, but again, I'm very attached to actually how easy or beautiful or intuitive it looks like. And the newest level and engagement of games that I've seen is just, it's amazing. Like again, as a user, you wouldn't see that it's necessarily on blockchain and on Near, which I think is the ultimate answer.
That is definitely the point, to make the gears of software invisible to us poor humans who can barely comprehend what's going on as it is. I often kind of bring up this example of like a person interacting with a social network, like a TikTok or a Twitter or, Facebook. Like it's just you versus against a gigantic robot, that's been built by like thousands of people inside of an artificial intelligence company that then's been trained by billions of people across preferences, across millions of data points, and it's like, you think you're clicking on a photo, but no, you are inside of a giant mechanical artifact. And I think with blockchains, in some ways we'll be breaking those machines, but in other ways we're also building the gears underneath that we want people to use, but not necessarily be obsessed about.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the other directions I wanted to explore with you was, you had mentioned DAOs and human organization and community, and these patterns are just emerging in terms of how to organize the various economic and like business elements of an ecosystem versus a protocol or a lab versus the projects that are on it. So we've got the Near protocol, which is generating, computation and which is validated by various economic software actors. And then we've got the Near Foundation, which I'll ask you what it does. And so my question to you is, how do you think about the role of the foundation versus the founders and the core development team? What are the incentives like? And maybe underneath that, like, what is the problem that such industry structure is trying to fix?
So if at the center of a picture, you have the Near protocol, which is open source, on that protocol, as you've said, you can have different, actors and participants, and to help continuously develop what the protocol is and where it goes. And so for Near in our ecosystem, what that means is that you would have, for example, players such as Aurora, which is our EVM. You'd have players such as Calimero, which is private shard. You'd have players such as Pagoda, which is Web3 tooling for entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth, right? So that's like, again, picture, protocol, open source. And then around that, you have different actors and different contributors to continuously evolve the thing. Then if you look at the different actors, small or large, but that are participating in the ecosystem, you do have several things. So one, we actually have regional hubs, and I'll come back on that, but like regional hubs for us are so powerful because again, in a global world, there is nothing that replaces like local language, local community, getting together, especially now that the world is reopening up, but like getting together as meetup, learning together, hacking together, like all that, nothing replaces that in doing it locally. So regional hubs are pebbles within the near ecosystem. Within our ecosystem also, we have guilds and groups that are focused on certain special thematics. So for example, Proximity Lab is focused on everything related to DeFi. Human Guild is focused on things that are related to gaming. We have ecosystem funds, which are VC funds that are focused on what are the companies that are being built in the near ecosystem. And those are actually in different geographies. And so the foundation is one pebble in an ecosystem that is growing every day and very rapidly. Today, it's over 500 projects. It's over 500 active DAOs. It's just continuously growing with more and more engagements and more projects, which can be, anything from, DAO, NFT, gaming, DeFi, like anything that as you can imagine. So within that ecosystem, the foundation does three things. One is we exist to help raise awareness of not only near protocol, but also like open web and Web3, right? Because I think sometimes in the crypto community, we are in our bubble, we understand each other, but the reality is there's a lot of jargon. The mainstream media is also, not necessarily always playing favor to how, what real things are happening. So I deeply believe we have a really big role of education. It's also really important for the next generation of students to understand actually what this technology is, because I believe everybody's career is going to be impacted by that, right? So to that effect, we have Near University, which is a program where whether you're a developer or an entrepreneur, you can start getting your hands into it and figuring out what this could mean for you. And then we also engage in strategic partnership, right? So for example, I mentioned earlier Sweatcoin, Orange DAO. We engage in like strategic partnership to bring to life real use cases, again, in a sense of like awareness and education. So that's one big pillar of what the foundation does. The second pillar is actually support. So how can we support entrepreneurs, founders, team who want to build on Near, whether it's actually directly via our grant program or by actually directing people within our ecosystem on where they can get the best, help. So if you're DeFi, then proximity is probably the right place to get that help. And the last pillar of what we do as a foundation is thinking through actually governance and external regulatory engagement. So not that, this is only the foundation to do, but sometimes especially if ecosystems are early on in their journey, you need a forcing mechanism to kickstart off the conversation and to put that off the ground. So for example, we are in an environment where regulation is constantly moving and changing, and back to education, we can help, right? As a foundation, this narrative also of like, it's not just DeFi, it's also, there's a lot in Web3. And I think it's actually a very positive thing for thinking how people will engage and work and so on and so forth. That narrative we help a lot with. So those are the three pillars, and that's how the foundation fits as a pebble in a continuously growing ecosystem of things.
I'm very interested in this topic because I think the shape of value creation not is changing, that's sort of like naive to say, but is flowing into a different set of responsibilities. And I think it's surprising for many people in our space, like where the value creation happens. And so you talked about learning business very early on in our conversation. I'm interested in the nuts and bolts, like, when you're managing the foundation, when you have your operator hat on and you're setting, the key performance indicators and you're setting numbers for people to hit. What are those metrics? What are those numbers? What does internal excellence quantitatively look like for managing a foundation on a layer one protocol?
The way we think about it as a foundation is the North Star metric is actually weekly active engaged users, right? So our deepest belief is actually the vision and the mission is like, how can we actually build an environment and an ecosystem on which there are billions of engaged users, whether they know or not about the technology as we've talked about, right? So therefore, North Star metric, weekly active engaged users. And then the way we decouple that back to the three pillars and how we think about the role of the foundation, which is like awareness, support, and governance, the simplest flywheel that we came about with is like, well, you need talent, right? Number one is like at the top of that funnel is like you need a humongous amount of talent, and not just developers, but you need actually talent who understands economics, and talent who understand marketing, and talent who understand operations, and so on. So you need talent. So for that, we look at how can we bring 500,000 of active qualified students through the programs and the different programs that we have at the foundation. So that's the top of the funnel. And then that talent, ultimately, the belief is that if you have talent, they'll build great projects. And so how can we actually ensure that the project that come have the support that they need and therefore become successful project? And to be successful, it's a hack, but you can look at two things. We believe one is actually you can look at active engaged users that the projects have, or you can also look at, is there external validation from maybe other funds that are backing that projects to help it grow and scale? So it starts with talent, then it goes into projects, and ultimately these projects, if they're the right one, will give you the active engaged users. And so that's how we think about our flywheel. And then at the center of that, we think, okay, governance, right? What are the things as a foundation that you can and cannot do? Like what's the how do you bring trust and help the ecosystem on that? It's like in a Linux environment, like the Linux Foundation is a pebble of like stability and trust and so on and so forth. So we also think along those lines for the Near Foundation. So those are the KPI that we track and that we monitor, on a daily basis, and that we basically go for. The real difficulty is that because it's so decentralized, and I hear that so much from the team, they're like, yeah, but what can we really control? And fair enough, can we really control weekly active engaged users on the entire Near ecosystem? No, we can't. But when my deepest belief is actually, if you have a healthy North Star, then actually everybody's action goes into fulfilling that. So if you pick the wrong North Star, though, then everybody could be focused on, something totally different, which is irrelevant and might just create hype. And then you don't create underlying lasting value. So that's how we think about it.
That's fantastic. And I know we're coming up on time, but I want to squeeze in one more very difficult question, which is, when these metrics that you want to orient around, even when you're doing a startup and you're doing a business, when you're doing a neobank and you're thinking about deposits and users, or when you're marketing a payment app and you're thinking about flows, for a protocol, the industry-wide metric is engagement and apps and value locked and all these things. But because the goal is bigger, you're trying to create an economy, not a company, you're also in the winds of the market so much more, and I found in a lot of the work that we do in Consensus and then just through observation that there's a lot you can do in terms of kind of leaning into the boat, but then the waters around you tend to splash you around quite a bit. How do you think about the context of the market and the macro environment, and are there things that you as the foundation, or more broadly, actors in the space, are doing to try to create some anti-fragility relative to the broader context that we can't control?
Yeah, and that's a deep question. So a couple of things on that. I think you're right? There is number one, there's actually the metrics that everybody follows or that the market is really focused on. And, there is almost like a thinking through, well, that's how value is created. Now, I think if you really want to think long-term, then you need to have the right long-term metrics for that. So there is almost trying to bring a change of narrative of what really matters. Now, I think in the broader economic context of what's happening right now, I think there is some fundamental shift in society that are absolutely fascinating to watch and to try to make sense of, right? So there is a conceptual sense around what is money, that I think, the conversation has been going on now for a couple of years, but I think it's never been so strong as it is today. And this concept of ultimately through COVID, governments have printed a lot of money, right? But so where does it come from? Where does it come from? And it links back to, okay, how is trust being built, but also why do we use money for? And I think that's where actually more broadly and generally speaking, crypto and crypto assets and crypto economies have a really interesting to play. Then linked to that, I think it's also interesting to think through, central banks and treasuries that are being built and asset diversification that are happening currently in the central banks. And and probably a role increasingly bigger and bigger that in some governments and in some countries, cryptocurrencies are starting to take. So I think that's also another really interesting like macro thing that's happening. And then, last but not least, but there is also like more the overall general movement of where money is flowing, right? And I think right now it's fair to say that there has been a lot of attention and a lot of capital flowing into the entire crypto space, which is fantastic because it's helping attract a lot of talent. It's helping builders build. It's basically helping push things forward much, much faster, right? Now, how much of that can continue at the scale as which it is versus will there be, I've lived already, as we mentioned at the beginning, I've lived already through a first recorrection of a market and it's brutal, right? So will we see something else like that? And I think therefore that's why this idea of like thinking very long term is super, super important, right? Because if you don't have that, North Star thinking long term through those very big macroeconomic things that are happening, whether it's actually COVID or Ukraine war or shift of globalization and role of central banks and so on and so forth, if you don't have like a long-term view of what good looks like, then I think if and when, something happens, then projects might not survive. So yeah, that's a bit of thoughts on a very deep question that probably could have been the entire podcast.
Yes, indeed. Fantastic answer. Really insightful conversation. If our listeners want to learn more about you or about Near, where should they go?
Go on near.org, or you also can find us obviously on Twitter at Near Foundation or at Near Protocol. Those are probably the best places. And then I'm also on Twitter, so Marieke Flament, and otherwise on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things FinTech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.